The Lenox Lounge occupied a corner building at 288 Lenox Avenue between West 124th and 125th Streets in Harlem. The establishment had opened in 1939 as a jazz club and bar, with Art Deco interiors, a long mahogany bar, and a back room that could be reserved for private meetings. By March 1950, the Lenox Lounge had become one of Harlem's most prominent night spots, attracting musicians, entertainers, business figures, and individuals from both legitimate and illegal enterprises. The back room was frequently used for meetings that required privacy and discretion. On the afternoon of March 14, 1950, at approximately 2:30, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson arrived at the Lenox Lounge for a scheduled meeting. He was 44 years old, dressed in a dark gray suit, white shirt, burgundy tie, and polished black shoes. Johnson's appearance was professional and unremarkable. He could have been a businessman, an attorney, or a government official rather than someone who controlled significant portions of Harlem's illegal gambling operations. He entered through the main entrance, nodded to the bartender who knew him, and proceeded to the back room where the meeting would be held. The meeting had been arranged by intermediaries over the previous 2 weeks. The participants included Johnson, representing Harlem's independent numbers operations, and 3 representatives from the Genovese crime family: Vincent Romano, a 52-year-old capo who oversaw gambling operations in the Bronx and northern Manhattan, Anthony Cardella, a 46-year-old associate who handled financial arrangements and revenue collection, and Joseph Marchetti, a 38-year-old enforcer who provided security for gambling operations and dealt with competitors who did not cooperate with mob interests. The purpose of the meeting was to renegotiate the financial arrangement between Johnson's Harlem operations and the Genovese family. The existing arrangement, established after Dutch Schultz's death in 1935 and negotiated with Lucky Luciano's organization, provided that Johnson would control numbers operations in Harlem while paying a percentage of revenue to the Italian mob. This percentage had been set at 15% when the original arrangement was made. The Genovese representatives were proposing to increase this percentage to 35%, citing rising operational costs, increased law enforcement pressure requiring higher payoffs to police and judges, and the general principle that Harlem's lucrative gambling market should contribute more substantially to the mob's overall revenue. Johnson entered the back room where the 3 Genovese representatives were already seated at a round table. The room was furnished simply: the table, 6 chairs, a small bar in the corner, curtains drawn over the windows to ensure privacy. An ashtray on the table held several cigarette butts, suggesting the men had been waiting for some time. Johnson took a seat at the table, positioning himself so he could see the door. Vincent Romano opened the discussion by acknowledging Johnson's punctuality and by expressing appreciation for Johnson's willingness to meet. Romano's tone was professional but condescending, the manner of someone accustomed to conducting negotiations from a position of superior power. Romano explained that the Genovese family had reviewed the financial arrangements throughout its territory and had concluded that revenue-sharing percentages needed to be adjusted to reflect current economic conditions and operational requirements. Romano stated that Harlem's numbers operations generated substantial revenue, more than most comparable gambling territories, yet paid a relatively modest percentage to the organization that provided protection and political connections. Romano proposed that the percentage paid by Johnson's operations should increase from 15% to 35%, effective immediately. Romano presented this not as a negotiation, but as a decision that had been made by the family's leadership and that Johnson was expected to accept. Anthony Cardella provided supporting financial information. He presented documents showing revenue estimates for Harlem's numbers operations, calculations of what 35% would represent in actual dollars, and comparisons to percentages paid by other gambling operations in other territories. The numbers suggested that even at 35%, Johnson's operations would remain highly profitable. Cardella emphasized that the increased percentage was reasonable and that Johnson should recognize it represented fair compensation for the protection and support the Genovese family provided. Joseph Marchetti said little during the initial presentation, but his presence communicated an implicit message that the proposed arrangement was not truly optional and that resistance would be met with consequences. Marchetti sat with his arms crossed, his expression neutral, his posture suggesting readiness to respond to any hostility. Johnson listened to the presentation without interruption. He did not take notes, did not ask clarifying questions, did not challenge the financial calculations. He sat with his hands folded on the table, his expression calm, his eyes moving between the three men as they spoke. When Romano finished presenting the proposal and asked for Johnson's response, Johnson remained silent for several seconds. Then Johnson stated simply that he needed time to consider the proposal. Romano replied that there was nothing to consider. The family had made a decision, and Johnson's role was to implement it. Johnson repeated that he needed time to evaluate how the proposed increase would affect his operations and to determine whether the arrangement remained viable. Romano's tone became less patient. He stated that the percentage increase was not negotiable, that it had been decided at levels above this meeting, and that Johnson was being informed rather than consulted. Johnson asked when the new percentage would take effect. Romano said immediately, beginning with the following week's collections. Johnson asked whether there would be any modification to the services the Genovese family provided in exchange for the increased percentage. Romano said the services would remain the same: protection from competing operations, political connections with law enforcement and courts, and general support for maintaining stable gambling operations. Johnson nodded slowly. He stood from his chair, pushed it back under the table, and stated that he would not be accepting the proposed arrangement. Romano's expression shifted from confidence to surprise. He asked what Johnson meant. Johnson repeated calmly that he would not be increasing the percentage paid to the Genovese family from 15% to 35%. Romano said that Johnson did not appear to understand. This was not a request, but an instruction from the family's leadership. Johnson stated that he understood perfectly, but that the proposed increase was neither justified by economic conditions nor supported by any change in the services provided. Johnson said he would continue to operate under the existing 15% arrangement, and that if the Genovese family wished to modify that arrangement, they were welcome to discuss it further, but he would not be implementing the proposed increase. Romano stood as well, his voice rising slightly, and he told Johnson that refusing the family's decision was a serious mistake. Johnson replied that he had made no mistake. He had simply declined an unreasonable demand. Marchetti moved his chair back. positioning himself between Johnson and the door in what appeared to be an attempt at physical intimidation. Johnson glanced at Marchetti but did not acknowledge the implicit threat. Johnson stated that he appreciated the meeting and the opportunity to hear the proposal, but that he had other commitments and needed to leave. Romano said that Johnson should reconsider before walking out of the room because leaving without agreement would have consequences. Johnson replied that he was confident the Genovese family would reach reasonable conclusions once they had time to reflect on the situation. Johnson walked toward the door. Marchetti did not move aside initially, forcing Johnson to alter his path slightly. Johnson showed no reaction to this minor obstruction. He opened the door, walked out of the back room, proceeded through the main area of the Lenox Lounge, and exited onto Lenox Avenue. He walked north on Lenox Avenue at a steady pace, his expression neutral, giving no indication of concern or urgency. Behind him in the back room of the Lenox Lounge, the three Genovese representatives remained for several minutes in silence. Romano had not expected Johnson to refuse outright. The pattern in such meetings was that gambling operators might negotiate around the edges, ask for a lower percentage, request a gradual implementation, propose additional services to justify increased payments, but they did not simply refuse and walk out. Romano had dealt with dozens of gambling operators over 2 decades, and none had responded as Johnson had. Cardella expressed confusion about what had just occurred. He asked whether Johnson understood the implications of refusing the family's decision. Romano said he believed Johnson understood perfectly. That was what made the refusal troubling. An operator who refused out of misunderstanding or panic could be managed through further explanation or through intimidation. An operator who refused calmly after full understanding represented a different kind of problem. Marchetti suggested that Johnson's refusal required an immediate response to demonstrate that such behavior would not be tolerated. Romano considered this but hesitated. Johnson was not a typical gambling operator. He controlled Harlem's numbers operations with precision and maintained order in a volatile neighborhood and had relationships throughout Harlem's community that went beyond simple criminal enterprise. Acting against Johnson without understanding what Johnson planned to do next could create complications. Romano decided to report Johnson's refusal to Vito Genovese and to await instructions before taking action. The 3 men left the Lenox Lounge approximately 20 minutes after Johnson's departure. As they drove back to their offices in Lower Manhattan, they discussed what leverage the family could apply to force Johnson's compliance. Cutting off political connections, encouraging competing operations, applying direct pressure through enforcement actions, but each option presented complications they had not fully considered. Johnson walked from the Lenox Lounge to his residence on Edgecombe Avenue, a distance of approximately 8 blocks. He walked at a normal pace, stopping once to purchase cigarettes, showing no signs of agitation or concern. When he reached his residence, he went inside, changed from his suit into more casual clothing, and sat in his study thinking carefully about what had occurred and what would follow. Johnson understood that his refusal to accept the Genovese family's proposal would be reported to the family's leadership and that some form of response would follow. The family could not allow an operator to refuse their decisions without consequence, as that would undermine their authority throughout their territory. But Johnson also understood that the family's options for responding were more limited than they assumed. The proposed increase from 15% to 35% was economically significant. At current revenue levels, the increase would represent approximately $40,000 annually, a sum that would materially affect the profitability of Johnson's operations and the resources available for maintaining his organization. But the economic impact was less important than what the increase signified. An attempt to assert more direct control over Harlem's operations by making Johnson more financially dependent on the Genovese family's favor. Johnson recognized that accepting the increase would establish a precedent. If the percentage could be increased from 15 to 35% through unilateral decision, it could be increased again in the future using the same method. And the existing arrangement worked, because both parties benefited. Johnson controlled operations and paid a percentage. The family received revenue without direct management responsibilities. Changing this to a relationship where the family could dictate terms unilaterally would fundamentally alter the balance of power. But Johnson also recognized that simply refusing without a strategy would be futile. The Genovese family had substantial resources, enforcers, political connections, relationships with other criminal organizations. If the family committed fully to forcing Johnson's compliance or to replacing him with operators more willing to accept their terms, they could likely succeed through sustained pressure and violence. Johnson's strategy needed to accomplish several objectives simultaneously. First, and he needed to demonstrate that forcing his compliance would be more costly to the Genovese family than maintaining the existing arrangement. Second, he needed to create pressures that would make the family's leadership reconsider whether increasing control over Harlem was worth the complications it would create. Third, he needed to do this without direct confrontation that would force the family to respond with overwhelming force to maintain their reputation. Johnson began by gathering information about the Genovese family's current situation. Through his network of contacts in Harlem and in other parts of New York, Johnson learned that the family was facing several pressures that made this a particularly difficult time for them to commit resources to a conflict in Harlem. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics was conducting aggressive investigations of Italian organized crime families' involvement in heroin distribution. Several mid-level mob figures had been arrested in recent months, and federal prosecutors were building cases that could result in substantial prison sentences. This meant that the families were being more cautious about activities that might attract additional law enforcement attention. The Genovese family was also dealing with internal tensions. Vito Genovese was attempting to consolidate his position as boss following his return from exile in Italy. But other factions within the family questioned his judgment and authority. Genovese needed to demonstrate strength to maintain his position, but he also needed to avoid actions that would create problems with law enforcement or with other families. Competition between New York's 5 crime families was intensifying as each sought to expand revenue and territory. The Genovese family was engaged in disputes with the Gambino and Lucchese families over control of various rackets. These disputes consumed management attention and resources, making it more difficult to handle additional conflicts effectively. Johnson identified several allies who could help create pressure on the Genovese family from different directions. The first was Malcolm Little, who would later become known as Malcolm X. In 1950, Malcolm was a 24-year-old hustler operating in Harlem who Johnson had known for several years. Malcolm was intelligent, articulate, and had connections throughout Harlem's street-level criminal economy. Johnson enlisted Malcolm to spread information throughout Harlem's gambling operations about the Genovese family's attempt to dramatically increase revenue percentages, framing it as an indication that the family was experiencing financial pressures and might be less reliable as partners. The second ally was a coalition of Harlem's independent numbers operators who paid percentages to various mob families. Johnson contacted approximately 15 operators and explained that if the Genovese family could unilaterally increase his percentage from 15 to 35%, they could do the same to other operators. Johnson proposed that the operators should coordinate their responses to resist arbitrary percentage increases and should share information about mob families' demands and actions. The third ally was Stephanie St. Clair, Johnson's former boss and mentor, who had retired from active involvement in numbers operations, but who retained substantial influence and knowledge. St. Clair had decades of experience navigating relationships between Harlem's black operators and Italian mob families. Johnson met with St. Clair and explained the situation. St. Clair advised that the key to resisting the Genovese family's pressure was to make clear that forcing compliance would create more problems than it solved, not through direct threats, but through demonstrating that Harlem's operations would become unstable and difficult to manage if Johnson was pressured or replaced. The fourth ally was a Genovese family associate named Frank Costello, who maintained relatively moderate positions within the organization and who had business interests that depended on stability in Harlem. Costello was not directly involved in the percentage negotiation but would be affected by disruption in Harlem's gambling operations. Johnson sent word to Costello through intermediaries explaining that the proposed percentage increase was creating resistance and that insisting on it might destabilize operations that currently functioned smoothly. The fifth ally was a collection of legitimate business owners in Harlem who benefited from the stable environment that Johnson's control over gambling operations helped maintain. These business owners, restaurant operators, retail merchants, entertainment venue owners, had no direct involvement in illegal gambling, but understood that Johnson's management kept street-level crime under control and prevented the violence that occurred when multiple competing criminal operations fought for territory. Johnson met with several business owners and explained that pressure from the Genovese family might force changes that would make Harlem less stable. With these allies identified, Johnson implemented a strategy designed to create multiple forms of pressure on the Genovese family. The strategy had several components that would unfold over weeks. First, Johnson began operating more openly in ways that demonstrated his independence from mob control. He held meetings with gambling operators in public locations rather than in discreet settings. He made decisions about gambling territories and revenue distribution without consulting with Genovese representatives. He sent messages through his organization emphasizing that operations would continue under existing arrangements, regardless of what the mob demanded. And this signaled to the Genovese family that Johnson was not preparing to negotiate, but was prepared to operate independently. Second, Johnson arranged for Malcolm Little and other trusted associates to spread carefully crafted information throughout Harlem's criminal networks. The information suggested that the Genovese family's demand for increased percentages reflected financial pressures from legal problems and internal conflicts. The information raised questions about whether the family could continue providing the political protection and competitive advantages they had historically offered. This created doubt among other gambling operators about whether maintaining relationships with the Genovese family was beneficial. Third, Johnson coordinated with the coalition of independent numbers operators to respond collectively to any pressure from mob families. The operators agreed to share information about demands, threats, or enforcement actions. They agreed to maintain existing percentage arrangements without modification unless new terms were negotiated respectfully. They agreed to support each other if individual operators faced retaliation for refusing arbitrary demands. This collective stance made it more difficult for the Genovese family to apply pressure to one operator without creating broader resistance. Fourth, Johnson reduced the revenue flowing to the Genovese family through subtle operational adjustments. He modified betting structures to shift activity toward lower revenue operations that generated less absolute payment even at the same percentage. He delayed collections slightly, creating cash flow disruptions for the family without technically violating agreements. He reduced the frequency of coordination meetings between his organization and Genovese representatives, making it harder for the family to monitor operations or to identify how revenues were being affected. Fifth, Johnson positioned himself as essential to maintaining stability in Harlem. He increased his visibility in the community through charitable activities, distributing meals, paying rent for families facing eviction, providing assistance to businesses experiencing difficulties. He strengthened relationships with religious leaders, legitimate business figures, and community organizations. And he made clear through his actions that he was deeply embedded in Harlem's social structure and that attempting to replace him would create community resistance and operational chaos. The execution of this strategy unfolded over approximately 6 weeks from mid-March through late April 1950. The effects accumulated gradually rather than producing immediate dramatic results. In the first week after Johnson walked out of the Lenox Lounge meeting, the Genovese family attempted to assess what Johnson intended to do. Vito Genovese was informed of Johnson's refusal and reportedly expressed anger that an independent operator had rejected the family's decision so directly. Genovese instructed Romano to apply pressure to bring Johnson into compliance, but to do so carefully to avoid creating a public conflict that would attract law enforcement attention. Romano sent messages to Johnson through intermediaries indicating that the family expected Johnson to reconsider his position and to implement the new percentage within 2 weeks. Johnson did not respond to these messages. Romano interpreted this silence as continued defiance and reported to Genovese that Johnson appeared to be preparing for confrontation. In the second week, Romano attempted to apply economic pressure by encouraging 2 smaller gambling operators to expand into territories that Johnson controlled. The operators were offered favorable percentages and protection if they could establish competing numbers operations in Harlem. But when these operators attempted to recruit runners and establish betting locations, they encountered unexpected resistance. Malcolm Little and other Johnson associates spread information that the operators were working with the mob to undermine Harlem's independent operations. Community members refused to cooperate with the new operators, and the attempts to establish competing operations failed within days. In the third week, the Genovese family discovered that revenue from Harlem was declining. The percentage payments Johnson's organization delivered were smaller than expected based on historical patterns. Romano investigated and found that Johnson had modified operations in ways that reduced taxable revenue without technically violating existing agreements. Romano reported to Genovese that Johnson appeared to be deliberately reducing the value of the family's percentage. In the fourth week, Romano received concerning information from other gambling operators. Several operators who had been reliable partners of the Genovese family were now questioning the family's demands for increased percentages. Some operators had formed informal coordination with each other and were collectively resisting arbitrary changes to financial arrangements. Romano recognized that Johnson's refusal was having a broader effect. It was encouraging other operators to challenge the family's authority. In the fifth week, Frank Costello contacted Genovese and expressed concern about the situation in Harlem. Costello explained that he had business interests that depended on stable operations in Harlem, and that the conflict with Johnson was creating uncertainty that affected those interests. Costello suggested that insisting on the percentage increase might not be worth the complications it was creating. Genovese rejected this advice initially, stating that allowing Johnson to refuse the family's decisions would undermine their authority throughout New York. But in the sixth week, additional pressures converged. Federal law enforcement arrested 3 Genovese family members on narcotics charges, creating urgency to reduce activities that might attract additional investigation. Internal tensions within the family escalated as factions questioned whether Genovese's aggressive approach to territorial expansion was wise given legal pressures. Several legitimate business owners in Harlem contacted Genovese representatives to express concern that instability in Harlem's gambling operations was affecting the broader business environment in ways that harmed everyone. By late April, Genovese concluded that forcing Johnson's compliance was not worth the accumulated costs. The percentage increase that had seemed like a straightforward assertion of authority had instead created multiple complications: resistance from other operators, reduced revenue from Harlem, internal questions about Genovese's judgment, concerns from business interests, and risks of law enforcement attention. Genovese instructed Romano to arrange a meeting with Johnson to negotiate a resolution. Romano contacted Johnson through an intermediary and requested a meeting. Johnson agreed and suggested they meet again at the Lenox Lounge. The meeting occurred on April 28, 1950, approximately 6 weeks after the previous meeting at which Johnson had walked out. This time, Romano's approach was different. He acknowledged that the proposed percentage increase had created more complications than anticipated. He proposed that the existing 15% arrangement should continue without modification, with the understanding that both parties would communicate more effectively about any future proposed changes before implementing them unilaterally. Romano emphasized that the Genovese family valued the stability that Johnson provided in Harlem and wanted to maintain a cooperative relationship. Johnson listened and then stated his terms. The percentage would remain at 15% permanently, not subject to unilateral increases. Any future proposed changes would require genuine negotiation with Johnson having authority to decline proposals he considered unreasonable. The Genovese family would not interfere with Johnson's management of Harlem's operations or attempt to encourage competing operations. Johnson would continue coordinating with the family on matters affecting broader mob interests, but would operate independently within Harlem. Romano hesitated, recognizing that these terms represented Johnson dictating rather than negotiating. But Romano also recognized that the alternative, continued conflict, had proven more costly than maintaining the existing arrangement. Romano agreed to Johnson's terms and said he would communicate them to Genovese for formal approval. 2 days later, Romano confirmed that Genovese had accepted the arrangement. The percentage would remain at 15%. Johnson would maintain independent authority over Harlem's operations, and the relationship would continue on the basis that had been established in 1935, following Dutch Schultz's death. Johnson had achieved a complete strategic victory. He had refused an unreasonable demand, had walked out of a meeting calmly when threatened, and had used the weeks that followed to create conditions where accepting his refusal was less costly to the Genovese family than continuing to insist on compliance. The victory came not from violence or direct confrontation, but from strategic patience, coalition building, and understanding how to create multiple simultaneous pressures that accumulated into institutional calculations favoring his position. The broader impact of this negotiation extended beyond Johnson's immediate situation. Other gambling operators throughout New York recognized that the Genovese family's attempt to unilaterally increase percentages had failed. This demonstrated that mob families' authority was not absolute, and that operators with sufficient strategic intelligence and community support could resist arbitrary demands. Several operators began coordinating more formally to share information and to resist exploitative terms from mob families. Within the Genovese family, the failure to force Johnson's compliance contributed to questions about Vito Genovese's leadership. Genovese had insisted on the percentage increase as a demonstration of strength, but the outcome had instead demonstrated limitations on the family's power, and this weakened Genovese's position in internal family politics and contributed to challenges he would face in subsequent years. For Johnson personally, the successful resistance to the Genovese family's demands enhanced his reputation as someone who understood power dynamics with exceptional sophistication. Johnson was known for intelligence and strategic thinking, but this incident demonstrated those qualities in ways that became part of Harlem's collective understanding of who Johnson was and how he operated. The story of Johnson walking out of the negotiation calmly, and the panic that his departure created for the Genovese representatives, became part of Harlem's oral history. In later retellings, details would sometimes be simplified or embellished, but the essential story remained, that Johnson had been presented with an ultimatum and had refused it quietly, and had then systematically created conditions where his refusal had to be accepted. For those who understood strategic power, the incident illustrated several principles. First, that apparent strength could be a form of weakness if it was inflexible. The Genovese family had approached the negotiation from a position of superior force, but that force was useless if applying it would create more problems than it solved. Second, that walking away from a bad deal was often more powerful than continuing to negotiate from weakness. Johnson's calm departure had forced the Genovese family to confront what would happen if they pushed him too far, and that confrontation had revealed vulnerabilities they had not anticipated. Third, that power operated through networks rather than through individual strength alone. Johnson's ability to resist the Genovese family's pressure came not from his personal capacity for violence, but from his relationships throughout Harlem and throughout New York's criminal economy. Those relationships gave him options that isolated individual operators did not have. Fourth, that institutional authority was maintained through perception, and that challenging that perception strategically could force institutions to recalculate their interests. The Lenox Lounge, where both meetings had occurred, became informally known in Harlem as the location where Johnson had demonstrated these principles. For years afterward, when gambling operators or criminal figures faced pressure from more powerful organizations, they would sometimes reference the Lenox Lounge meetings as an example of how strategic withdrawal and patient pressure could produce victories that direct confrontation could not achieve. When Bumpy Johnson died in July 1968, 18 years after the incident at the Lenox Lounge, obituaries in Harlem newspapers mentioned his long career controlling Harlem's numbers operations and his complex relationship with Italian organized crime families. The 1950 negotiation was referenced as an example of Johnson's strategic intelligence and his understanding that power came from positioning rather than from force alone. For historians and scholars who later examined organized crime dynamics in mid-20th century New York, at the Johnson-Genovese negotiation, when documentation could be found, represented an example of how power operated in criminal enterprises through negotiation and strategic maneuvering rather than simply through violence. The incident demonstrated that even in contexts where force was readily available, actual power often came from understanding systems, building coalitions, and creating conditions where one's position had to be accepted because forcing compliance was too costly. The legacy of the incident extended beyond Johnson's lifetime. Criminal operators in Harlem and elsewhere learned from Johnson's approach to dealing with more powerful organizations. The principle that walking away from a bad deal could be more powerful than accepting it out of fear became part of the strategic knowledge that circulated in criminal networks. The understanding that apparent authority could be challenged when the costs of enforcement exceeded the benefits of compliance became part of how operators thought about their relationships with mob families. For the Genovese family, the incident became a cautionary example about the limitations of authority based primarily on threat of force. The family continued to operate successfully for decades after 1950, but they approached relationships with independent operators more carefully, recognizing that operators with strong community support and strategic intelligence could resist demands that seemed unreasonable, even when those demands were backed by substantial organizational power. The calm with which Johnson had walked out of the meeting, showing no anger, no fear, no concern, became the detail that people remembered most clearly. And that calm communicated confidence that Johnson had options and resources that the Genovese representatives had not fully considered. The panic that reportedly ensued after Johnson's departure came not from what Johnson had said or threatened, but from what his calm departure implied, that he was prepared for whatever came next, and that forcing his compliance would be more difficult than the Genovese family had assumed. This was the essence of strategic power, as Johnson understood and practiced it, that the most effective demonstrations of strength often involved restraint rather than aggression, that walking away calmly could be more intimidating than staying to argue, and that patience combined with systematic pressure could force opponents to accept outcomes they initially believed they could dictate. Now, the story represented a particular kind of victory, one achieved not through overwhelming force or dramatic confrontation, but through understanding how power actually operated in complex institutional environments, through building coalitions that extended one's reach beyond individual capacity, and through creating conditions where accepting one's terms was less costly than continuing to insist on alternatives. These principles would remain relevant long after the specific incident and long after Johnson's death, as examples of how strategic intelligence and patient execution could produce victories that noise and confrontation never could.